There's no seat for you, Clara. My sister Beatrice didn't even look at me when she said it. She just pointed with a perfectly manicured nail towards a lonely stool by the kitchen door, next to the overflowing trash can. I looked over at the beautifully set tables, every chair filled with her laughing friends and our family, each place marked with a little gold-painted name card, every name but mine. My mother Helen caught my eye from across the room and gave a tiny, helpless shrug. My father Robert just stared intently at his shoes. They weren't just watching it happen, they were letting it happen. Have you ever been in a room full of people who are supposed to love you but felt completely and utterly invisible? That day, they didn't just exclude me, they tried to erase me, they treated me like garbage. A year later, they'd find out that the garbage they threw away had bought the entire dump. This is how I did it. The air in the private room of the Gilded Pear, the kind of restaurant where the water glasses are never empty, was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and triumph. My sister Beatrice, Bea, to everyone but me was the queen of this little kingdom. Pregnant and glowing, she held court from a throne-like wicker chair draped in white silk. I'm Clara Evans, the younger sister, the quiet one, the one who went to a state college instead of an Ivy League, the one with a sensible, low-paying admin job, while Bea managed a portfolio of philanthropic interests, which was code for spending her husband Derek's money. I clutched the gift bag in my hand. It wasn't much. A set of classic hand-bound children's books I'd spent weeks hunting down in second-hand shops. It felt meaningful to me, but I knew in this room it would look cheap. I had rehearsed my entrance. A bright smile, a warm congratulations, blend into the background. But I hadn't prepared for this. There's no seat for you, Clara. The words hung in the air, sharp and clear. The chatter around us didn't stop, but it felt like a bubble of silence had formed around the two of us. Bea's eyes, the same shade of blue as mine, were cold. She wasn't being forgetful. This was a statement. "Oh," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I thought. Mom said." "Mom doesn't know the final head count," Bea said, waving a dismissive hand. She gestured again, with more force this time, toward the forgotten corner of the room. "Just sit over there for now. We'll figure it out." The stool was wooden, hard, and isolated. It was positioned right beside the swinging double doors that led to the kitchen, a constant whirlwind of clattering dishes and shouted orders. Next to it was a tall, elegant silver trash can, already starting to fill with discarded ribbons and wrapping paper. I was literally seated with the refuse. My eyes scanned the room, desperately searching for an ally. My father, Robert, was deep in conversation with one of Derek's uncles, his back turned squarely towards me. He'd always been good at avoiding conflict, especially if it meant standing up for me against Bea. Then I saw my mother, Helen. She was sitting at the main table, right next to Derek's mother, Mrs. Gable. She met my gaze for a fleeting second. Her expression was pained, a quick flash of guilt, before she gave that tiny, almost imperceptible shrug. It was the shrug of a coward, the shrug that said, "Please don't make a scene, please just take it." So I did. I walked the long, lonely path across the plush carpet to my designated corner. The journey felt like miles. I could feel the eyes on my back, the pitying looks, the smirks. I sat on the hard stool, my back straight, placing the gift bag carefully at my feet. From my vantage point, I had a perfect panoramic view of my own humiliation. I watched them play the silly baby shower games, laughing and shouting. I watched them toast Bea and the baby with glasses of sparkling cider. I was a ghost at the feast. Derek, my brother-in-law, a man whose arrogance was his most defining feature, made sure I knew my place. During the gift opening, he held up a silver rattle from one of his friends. "Now this is a gift for a Vance baby," he boomed. Then his eyes found me in my corner. "Clara, did you get yours from the dollar store? Hope it's not a choking hazard." A wave of laughter washed over the room. It wasn't cruel, roaring laughter. It was worse. It was light, tittering laughter, the kind that dismisses you as a harmless, pathetic joke. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a burning blush of shame that I prayed the dim lighting would hide. The worst part, the absolute cruelest cut, was Mrs. Gable. She was the neutral observer, the jury. A woman of quiet but immense social standing, whose opinion my sister and her husband valued above all others. She wasn't laughing. She simply watched the entire exchange with a polite, completely unreadable mask. She saw Derek's cruelty. She saw my parents' silent complicity. She saw me perched on my stool of shame. And she did nothing. Her neutrality was its own kind of judgment, a confirmation that I was so far beneath her notice that my treatment didn't warrant an intervention. I wasn't even worth defending. That was the moment something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud crack, but a quiet, cold break. I stood up. No one noticed at first. I picked up my gift bag, walked back across the room, and placed it on the stool I had just vacated. I didn't say a word. I didn't look at my sister, or my parents, or Derek. I just turned and walked towards the exit. As I pushed through the heavy wooden door and stepped out into the bright, indifferent sunlight, I didn't feel sad anymore. The feeling of worthlessness that had clung to me like a shroud for years was burning away, leaving something else in its place. It was a cold, hard, crystalline resolve. I took a deep breath, the city air filling my lungs, cleansing the perfumed stench of that room. That night, I didn't cry. I made a promise to myself, a silent vow whispered into the darkness of my small apartment. This will never happen again. They will never make me feel like this again. The week after the baby shower was a nauseating haze of replayed moments. Bia's dismissive wave, my mother's helpless shrug, Derek's booming laugh, the silence from Mrs. Gable. Each memory was a small, sharp stone I turned over and over in my mind until its edges were razor sharp. The shame had curdled into a low, simmering anger that lived in the pit of my stomach. I went to my dead-end admin job at a faceless corporation, typing up reports no one would read, the click-clack of the keyboard, a hollow echo of my own empty existence. I was just going through the motions, a ghost in my own life. Then, on Friday afternoon, the final blow landed. An all-staff email, clinical and cold, appeared in my inbox. Subject: corporate restructuring. My department was being eliminated. My position was redundant. I was being laid off, effective immediately. I stared at the screen, the words blurring together. I wasn't even worth a face-to-face conversation, just a digital pink slip. I packed my sad little box of personal items, a wilting desk plant, a mug that said World's Okayest Admin, a photo of my family from a time I thought they loved me, and walked out into the world, jobless, humiliated, officially a failure by every metric my family held dear. I was at the absolute bottom. When I told my mother, her voice on the phone was a thick syrup of pity, and I told you so. Oh, Clara, honey, this is terrible. But maybe it's a blessing in disguise. I waited for the other shoe to drop. It didn't take long. You know, she continued, her voice lowering conspiratorially, the first thing you should do is call Beatrice. Apologize for leaving the shower like that. She was very hurt. Then you can ask Derek if he has any openings at his firm. I'm sure he could find a spot for you as a receptionist. You just have to swallow your pride a little. Swallow my pride. The words felt like swallowing acid. She wanted me to crawl back to the very people who had gleefully kicked me into the dirt and beg for scraps. The thought was so repulsive it made me physically sick. No, Mom, I said, my voice flat. I'm not doing that. I hung up before she could argue. For 2 days I didn't leave my apartment. I let their narrative win. I was Clara the loser, Clara the failure, useless, unemployed Clara. But the anger in my stomach was a persistent hot coal. It wouldn't let me surrender. On the 3rd day, I scoured online job boards, not for another soulless admin position, but for anything to just pay the rent. That's how I found the ad for a temporary filing clerk at a place called Sterling Properties. The pay was abysmal, less than I was making before. The description was mind-numbing: organize and archive several decades of physical files, must be meticulous and detail-oriented. It was a step backward in every conceivable way. It was perfect. It was a place to hide and lick my wounds. The offices of Sterling Properties were like a time capsule from the 1970s. Wood-paneled walls, worn-out orange carpet. the smell of old paper and stale coffee. My workspace was a small metal desk in a windowless room in the basement, surrounded by towering stacks of dusty file boxes. My job was exactly as advertised. I took brittle, yellowed folders filled with property deeds, zoning permits, surveyor maps, and endless contracts, and I filed them, A to Z, 1960 to 1990. The first week, my brain felt like it was turning to mush. The sheer monotony was a physical weight. But then something shifted. Out of sheer boredom, I started to actually read what I was filing. At first, it was just words on a page: easement, riparian rights, subparcel variants. Then, I started to see the patterns. I saw how one document, a zoning change from residential to commercial, connected to another, a land acquisition contract signed a month later. I saw how a tiny forgotten lot purchased for a pittance in 1968 was now the ground floor of a skyscraper. My lunch breaks became study sessions. I'd eat my sandwich with one hand and use my phone to look up legal terms with the other. After my shift ended, I'd stay for an extra hour, then two, pulling out old files and piecing together the stories they told. It was like archaeology. I was unearthing the skeletons of deals made 50 years ago. I wasn't just filing paper anymore. I was discovering a hidden language, a secret architecture of power. This was how the world was really built. Not with loud voices and fancy parties, but with quiet, patient, ironclad paperwork. I was uncovering the blueprints to a kingdom I never knew existed, and in that dusty, forgotten basement, a tiny, dangerous spark of an idea began to ignite. The basement at Sterling Properties became my sanctuary. The endless rows of gray filing cabinets were my library, the musty smell of old paper my perfume. I spent weeks lost in the archives, my world shrinking to the dimensions of an 8.5 by 11-inch folder. I learned to read the city's history, not through textbooks, but through the dry, legalistic language of land deals. I saw how fortunes were made on a single, well-timed signature and how they were lost through a single, overlooked clause. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I was working my way through a box labeled West Market Development, 1988. It was a massive commercial project from the firm's glory days. As I sorted through the brittle pages, a hand-drawn surveyor's map slipped out from between two contracts. It was old, the ink faded, but one detail caught my eye: a thin, dotted line running right through the middle of the main property, labeled Public Access Easement. I frowned. An easement is like a right-of-way. It meant someone else had the legal right to use a piece of that land. I cross-referenced the map with the final property deed. The easement wasn't mentioned. I kept digging, pulling file after file. I found the original purchase agreement, and there it was, in tiny print on the last page, a clause granting permanent access to the city for a future public walkway. It had been forgotten, papered over in the final deal, but it was legally binding. Then I remembered a name from a more recent file I'd glanced at. I scurried over to the active litigation cabinet. My heart began to pound. Sterling Properties was currently being sued by a neighboring company over that exact property boundary. The lawsuit claimed Sterling's building encroached on their land. But this old map, this forgotten easement, proved something else entirely. It proved that neither of them had exclusive rights to that sliver of land. The city did. It was an oversight that could have cost the firm millions in a settlement, or even the property itself. My hands were shaking slightly. This was bigger than just filing. I spent the rest of the day drafting a memo. I wasn't an expert, but I laid out the facts clearly, citing the file numbers, the dates, the specific clauses. I detailed how the forgotten easement invalidated the core claim of the lawsuit. I proposed a solution: proactively disclose the easement to the city and the opposing counsel, turning a potential disaster into an act of good faith transparency that would likely get the entire case dismissed. I typed it up, printed a single copy, and walked upstairs. The main office was empty except for the evening cleaning crew. I walked to the imposing oak door at the end of the hall. Arthur Sterling, President. I slipped the memo under his door and practically ran back to the safety of my basement. The next morning, I was summoned, not by an email, but by the firm's longtime office manager, a stern woman named Mrs. Pine, who looked at me as if she'd never truly seen me before. "Mr. Sterling wants to see you," she said, her voice laced with disbelief. Arthur Sterling's office was a museum of a bygone era: heavy leather chairs, a desk the size of a car, and walls lined with books, not just law tomes but philosophy, history, poetry. He was a man in his late 70s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through me. The memo was on the desk in front of him. He didn't ask me to sit. "Evans," he said, his voice a low rumble. He tapped a long finger on my memo. "Explain this to me, as if I'm an idiot." He didn't want praise. He wanted proof. So I walked him through it, step by step, my voice surprisingly steady. He interrupted me constantly, grilling me with questions. "How did you connect the 1988 map to the current litigation? What do you know about riparian rights? What's the statute of limitations on a prescriptive easement in this state?" He was testing the depth of my knowledge, searching for the boundary of my amateur education. I answered every question, drawing on the obsessive reading I'd been doing for weeks. When I finished, he was silent for a long time, just staring at me. The silence was more intimidating than the questions. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "I had a partner once," he said, his voice softening with the weight of memory. "Charismatic, handsome, knew how to work a room, married into a good family. He could sell anything to anyone. I trusted him completely, and he bled this company dry, one bad flashy deal at a time, lining his own pockets until there was almost nothing left. He reminded me of your brother-in-law." I flinched. How could he possibly know about Derek? He saw the look on my face. "I make it my business to know who works for me, Evans. Even the temporary filing clerks." He sighed, a sound full of old regret. "I got lazy, arrogant. I stopped reading the fine print. That's how you lose. Not in a big explosion, but in the little details you stop paying attention to." He leaned forward again, his eyes locking onto mine. "I see a hunger in you. The kind I used to have. You're not just looking at the papers, you're reading them, and you're not stupid." My heart was hammering against my ribs. "So here's the proposition," he said, his voice all business now. "You stop being my filing clerk, you become my apprentice. I'll teach you everything I know the right way, not the flashy way. We'll use my remaining capital to start small. We'll find undervalued assets, forgotten lots, like this easement you found. We will build something new from the ruins of the old." He held up a hand. "But this isn't a charity. I'm an old man, and I don't have time to waste. I expect a return on my investment. I want to build one last great thing before I'm done, and you, Clara Evans, are going to be my tool to do it." A tool? It should have sounded insulting, but after a lifetime of being called useless, a failure, a nobody, being called a tool felt like the highest compliment I had ever received. It was the first time anyone had ever looked at me and seen potential, seen a purpose. "Yes," I said, the word coming out stronger than I expected. "Yes, I will." My tiny one-bedroom apartment became a war room. The transformation was swift and total. I took down the generic art prints and the framed photos of a family I no longer recognized. In their place, I taped up city zoning maps, topographical charts, and pages of municipal code. My coffee table, once home to magazines and takeout menus, was now buried under stacks of books Mr. Sterling had given me: Fundamentals of Commercial Real Estate, Contract Law for Dummies, Advanced Financial Modeling, flowcharts detailing acquisition processes, snaked across my living room wall, connected by colored yarn like something out of a detective movie. My life was no longer my own. It belonged to the mission. Mr. Sterling was a relentless, unforgiving teacher. He wasn't interested in my feelings or my comfort. He was interested in results. My days became a grueling, compartmentalized regimen. Mornings were spent on site. He'd drag me out to muddy, forgotten plots of land at sunrise, forcing me to learn the practical side of the business. "Smell that, Evans?" He'd bark, pointing at a rusty pipe sticking out of the ground. "That's the smell of a leaking sewage line. That's a $100,000 problem you'd better learn to spot before you sign anything." I learned about soil composition, drainage patterns, and the logistics of construction. Afternoons were for the law. We'd sit in his dusty office, and he would drill me on zoning laws, permit applications, and variance procedures until my head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. He'd throw hypothetical situations at me. A client wants to build a 5-story building in a 3-story zone. What are your 3 best options for getting it approved? Go. I had to be sharp, precise, and fast. Evenings were my own, but they were not for rest, they were for the numbers. I enrolled in a series of online courses in corporate finance and accounting. While the city slept, I was hunched over my laptop, learning about pro forma statements, cap rates, and leveraged buyouts, the language of money. My diet consisted of instant noodles, black coffee, and the stale taste of exhaustion. I sold my car for a bus pass and a little extra capital. Every penny I had, every ounce of energy, was channeled into this secret education. My isolation was absolute. It had to be. I started dodging my family's calls, letting them go to voicemail. Their narrative of me was a useful camouflage. Let them think I was a failure. Let them believe I was drifting aimlessly. It was safer that way. One evening, my mother finally got through. Her voice was a weapon, coated in sweet, suffocating pity. "Clara? I was so worried. I haven't heard from you. Bea told me she heard you took a job as a secretary somewhere. Is that true, dear?" I could hear the unspoken words hanging in the air. "See? This is what you are. This is all you'll ever be." "I have a job, Mom," I said, staring at a complex spreadsheet on my screen. "Well, that's good," she said, though her tone said the opposite. "But you know, Derek was just saying he might have an opening for a receptionist at his main office. It would be much more respectable. You'd have benefits. You just have to be nice, Clara. Apologize to Bea, and ask him. It's not too late to get on the right track." The right track. Their track. The one that ended with me on a stool by the garbage. "I'm fine, Mom," I said, my voice tight. "I have to go." I hung up the phone and stared at the wall of maps. The exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing down on my shoulders, my eyelids, my very soul. But the loneliness was worse. Mr. Sterling was my mentor, my commander, but he was not my friend. He didn't offer encouragement or comfort. He offered challenges and criticism. The immense weight of my ambition, this secret, burning fire, was mine and mine alone to carry. Some nights, the silence in my apartment was so loud it was deafening. I'd trace the lines on the maps with my finger and wonder if I was brilliant or simply insane. There was no one to ask. There was only the work. And the work was everything. After months of grueling preparation, we were ready to make our first move. Mr. Sterling and I had identified the perfect target, a block of 4 dilapidated, nearly abandoned warehouses in a part of town the city had forgotten. The location was undesirable now, but we knew from studying the city's long-term development plans that a new light rail extension was slated to be built just 2 blocks away in 5 years. The land was a sleeping giant. The acquisition, however, was complicated. 3 of the warehouses were owned by a single investment company, happy to sell. But the 4th, the linchpin of the entire block, was still operating. It housed a small, family-run custom metalworking shop, owned by a man named George, who had been there for 40 years. He was the only holdout. One morning, I walked into Mr. Sterling's office to find him looking over a set of legal documents with a grimly satisfied expression. "I've found our path forward, Evans," he announced, sliding a folder across his massive desk. I opened it and began to read. The strategy he had devised was brutally efficient. It was technically legal, but it felt deeply wrong. Using an obscure loophole in the commercial zoning code, we could file a petition with the city to have the area redesignated for blight clearance. Because the surrounding properties were already derelict, the petition would almost certainly be approved. This designation would give us the power of eminent domain, allowing us to force George to sell his property to us for a price determined by a city appraisal, an amount that would be far below its true future value. It was fast. It was clean. It was highly profitable. It was a shark's move. "This is how the big boys play, Clara," Mr. Sterling said. his eyes watching me, gauging my reaction. It's not personal, it's business. We do this, we secure the entire block in under 90 days. No messy negotiations, no emotional holdouts. I took the folder home with me. For 2 nights, I barely slept. I spread the documents out on my floor, the cold, hard logic of the plan staring up at me. This was the fast track. This was the decisive victory I craved. This was the kind of move Derek would make without a second thought. The temptation was immense. It felt like a shortcut to the power I so desperately wanted, the power to prove them all wrong. But as I stared at the plan, I couldn't get a different image out of my head. Me, sitting on that stool next to the garbage can. The feeling of being deemed worthless, of being disposable, of having my fate decided by people who saw me as an obstacle to be managed. This plan would do the exact same thing to George, the metal worker. We would be treating him like garbage, just to make a bigger profit. We would be erasing his life's work because it was inconvenient for us. I would become the very thing I despised. On the third day, I walked back into Mr. Sterling's office. I placed his folder on the desk. Next to it, I placed my own. "I can't do it, sir," I said, my voice shaking but firm. He raised an eyebrow. "Can't? Or won't?" "Won't," I said. "This isn't why I'm doing this." I pushed my folder forward. "I have a counter-proposal." He opened it and began to read. My plan was slower, more complex, and definitely less profitable in the short term. It involved approaching George not as an adversary, but as a potential partner. I had researched his business. He was a master craftsman, but his business was failing because he couldn't afford to modernize. My proposal outlined 2 options for him. Option A, a generous buyout, far above the city appraisal value, plus a relocation package to help him move his shop to a better, more modern facility. Option B, equity. We would offer him a minority stake in our new development. We would build him a new, state-of-the-art workshop on the ground floor of our redeveloped property, rent-free for the first 10 years. He would be part of the success, not a victim of it. I held my breath as he read, my entire future hanging in the balance. He was silent for a full minute, his face unreadable. I had just defied my mentor, my only ally. He could have fired me on the spot. Finally, he looked up from the pages, and for the first time, a slow, genuine smile spread across his weathered face. It transformed him. "Good," he said simply. The word was filled with a surprising warmth. "I was hoping you'd say that." He tapped his own folder. "This was a test, Clara. The most important one. Any greedy fool can learn to use the law as a weapon. It takes character to build something that lasts." He pushed my folder back towards me. "This is how we play." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. "Now," he said, his voice filled with a new energy, "the real work begins." We went with my plan. The negotiations with George were tough but respectful. He was a proud, wary man, and it took weeks of meetings to earn his trust. In the end, he chose the equity partnership, his eyes lighting up at the architectural drawings for his new, modern workshop. The deal was done. Our first project, the Foundry Lofts, was officially underway. It was a modest success, but a clean one. We turned the blighted block into a beautiful mixed-use development with apartments, retail space, and George's gleaming new shop on the corner. It revitalized the neighborhood, and even got a small 2-paragraph feature in the business section of the local newspaper. My name wasn't mentioned, of course. The project was credited to Sterling Properties, but I knew, Mr. Sterling knew. That was enough. Or so I thought. A few weeks after the article was published, a thick manila envelope arrived at the office from the City Planning Commission. It was a stop work order. My blood ran cold. I tore it open. An anonymous complaint had been filed, alleging serious environmental violations on our site, specifically, improper disposal of industrial solvents from the old warehouse days. It was a complete fabrication. We had spent a fortune on a certified environmental cleanup before we ever broke ground. But an accusation is all it takes. All our permits were immediately frozen, construction ground to a halt. Our funding, tied to project milestones, was now threatened. We were suddenly drowning in a sea of bureaucratic red tape, facing legal fees and endless delays. I knew, instantly, who was behind it. Derek. My brother-in-law worked in commercial development. He traveled in circles where he would have heard whispers about the Foundry Lofts project. The idea of me, useless, pathetic Clara, being involved in a successful real estate deal, no matter how small, must have been an unbearable insult to his fragile gargantuan ego. He couldn't stand it. So he did what he always did. He used his family's money and influence to crush anyone he saw as a threat. The complaint was anonymous, but it had his fingerprints all over it. I was completely devastated. It felt like my family's narrative of me was a curse I could never escape. No matter what I did, no matter how hard I worked, they would always find a way to drag me back down, to remind me that I was a failure. I spiraled. I locked myself in my office, convinced I had not only failed myself, but had also ruined Mr. Sterling. I had taken his last bit of capital, his last chance to build something, and led it straight into a trap. I had proven my family right. I avoided Mr. Sterling for a full day, too ashamed to face him. Finally, he summoned me. I walked into his office, expecting him to fire me, to tell me he'd made a mistake in trusting me. He was sitting calmly behind his desk, sipping a cup of tea. He gestured for me to sit. "You're panicking, Evans," he said, his voice even. "He sabotaged us," I choked out, the words thick with despair. "Derek, my brother-in-law, he did this. We're finished. I've ruined everything." He let me finish, listening patiently to my frantic, hopeless assessment. When I was done, he took another sip of his tea. "This," he said, setting the cup down with a soft click, "is a gift." I stared at him, bewildered. "A gift? We're about to be sued into oblivion. The project is dead." "The project is not dead," he corrected me calmly. "It is delayed, and in that delay, we have been given invaluable intelligence. Weak, insecure men like your brother-in-law always reveal their playbook. He can't compete on merit, so he competes with whispers and lawyers. He uses his influence as a cudgel to bully people into submission. This is his only move." He leaned forward, his eyes sharp and clear. "He thinks he's landed a killing blow. He thinks we're bleeding out. He'll be watching us, expecting us to flail and cry and beg. So we will fight this. We will methodically, quietly, and publicly dismantle this fraudulent claim. We will win. And when we do, he will think he's merely lost a battle." He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. "And then, we go silent. We disappear from his radar. And while he's celebrating his temporary victory, we will be preparing for the war." Fighting the complaint was a long and expensive nightmare, but Mr. Sterling was right. We had the truth on our side, and a mountain of paperwork to prove it. We hired the best environmental lawyers, and after 3 painstaking months, the city's investigation completely exonerated us. The anonymous complaint was dismissed as frivolous and without merit. The stop work order was lifted. To an outside observer, it was a minor victory, a bureaucratic hurdle overcome, but for me, it was a profound lesson. Mr. Sterling's words echoed in my mind. "Never let your enemy know what you're building." Derek thought he had taught me a lesson, that he had put me back in my place. He thought I was still struggling with my little warehouse project. The truth was, the experience had changed my strategy completely. I was done playing small. I was done being a target. I was going to hunt bigger game, and I was going to do it in total secrecy. I threw myself back into the research, but this time, my focus was different. I wasn't just looking for undervalued land. I was looking for leverage. I was looking for a move so big, so audacious, that it would be completely invisible to people like Derek, who only saw the world through the lens of their own ego. My search led me to Lakeside Manor. It was the crown jewel of the state's hospitality industry. A sprawling historic resort, nestled on the shores of a pristine lake. It was the go-to venue for the weddings, galas, and corporate retreats of the ultra-wealthy. It was a symbol of old money and untouchable prestige. It was also the exact place that Bia had just booked for my nephew Leo's first birthday party. She had made the announcement in a family group chat with the subtlety of a fireworks display, a clear message to everyone about her and Derek's soaring social status. To them, Lakeside Manor was just a stage for their performance. To me, after weeks of obsessive digging through public financial records and industry reports, it was something else entirely, a wounded beast. The family who had owned it for generations was in deep financial trouble. They had taken out massive loans for renovations right before an economic downturn, and now they were leveraged to the hilt. They were quietly, desperately, seeking a buyer to avoid foreclosure, trying to sell the entire holding company that owned the resort to avoid a public, humiliating bankruptcy. I brought the file to Mr. Sterling. My hands were trembling as I laid it on his desk. This wasn't a warehouse. This was an institution. The numbers were terrifying. It was a risk on a scale we had never even contemplated. He spent an entire day reviewing my research, not saying a word. I paced my apartment that night, sick with anxiety. Had I finally gone too far? Was this the insane fantasy of a vengeful girl, not a sound business plan? The next morning, he called me into his office. He had a single sheet of paper in his hand. "ESAS Developments," he said, reading the name aloud. "Evans Sterling. I had my lawyers draw up the incorporation papers this morning." My breath caught in my throat. "This is a monster of a deal, Clara," he said, his expression serious. "It will take every penny we have, and every bit of courage. It's a high-wire act without a net. Are you ready for that?" This was it, the moment where the blueprint becomes reality. The fear was a cold knot in my stomach, but beneath it was that same hard resolve forged on the day of the baby shower. "Yes," I said, "I am." The next 2 months were a blur of clandestine activity. We operated through our new anonymous shell corporation, ES Developments. All negotiations were handled by a team of discreet lawyers Mr. Sterling had on retainer. We never met the owners. We were just a name on a document, a faceless entity with a surprising amount of capital. We structured a complex deal to acquire the entire holding company, not just the resort, but the land it sat on, the brand, the staff, the vendor contracts, everything. It was the biggest, most terrifying risk of my life. The day the deal was set to close, I sat in my apartment, staring at my phone, waiting for the call from the lawyer. My heart was a drum against my ribs. This was the point of no return. The phone rang. "Ms. Evans," the lawyer's voice said, calm and professional. "The wire transfer is complete. The documents are signed. ES Developments is now the sole proprietor of the Lakeside Manor Holding Company. Congratulations, you own the resort." I hung up the phone. A wave of vertigo washed over me. I walked over to the wall and looked at the map of the Lakeside Manor property I had pinned there weeks ago. It was no longer a dream. It was mine. On paper, in the quiet, unassailable language of contracts and deeds, I was the owner of the very place my sister had chosen to host her next grand performance of my family's superiority. The game had changed, and they didn't even know they were playing. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. It was delivered not by the regular mailman, but by a courier. The envelope itself was an act of aggression. Thick, cream-colored cardstock, with my name and address written in elegant, flowing calligraphy. It probably cost more than my lunch. Inside, the invitation to my nephew Leo's first birthday party was just as extravagant. Embossed with a gold teddy bear, it proudly announced the venue, the grand ballroom, at the prestigious Lakeside Manor. It felt less like an invitation, and more like a summons, a command performance to witness, once again, the glorious success of Bea and Derek. I stared at it, a bitter taste in my mouth. A few days later, my mother called, her voice a carefully constructed mix of casualness and pleading. "Clara, honey, you got the invitation, right? For little Leo's party?" "I got it, Mom," I said, my voice flat. "Oh good, it's going to be just beautiful. Lakeside Manor is, well, you know, it's the best." She paused, and then her tone shifted, becoming lower, more urgent. "Now, Clara, please, I'm asking you. Just come and be normal for one day. No drama. Bea is so stressed with the baby and planning this whole thing. Just smile, say happy birthday, and don't make a scene. Can you do that for me? For the family? The old wounds, the ones I thought had scarred over, began to ache. Her words transported me right back to that stool by the trash can. Don't make a scene, just take it. For a terrifying moment, the powerful woman who had just orchestrated a multi-million-dollar acquisition vanished, replaced by that scared, invisible girl. I felt a wave of crushing doubt. What was I even doing? Was this whole secret empire just a petty, insane revenge plot? Was I about to humiliate myself on an even grander scale? The thought of walking into that ballroom, into their territory, made my stomach clench. My hand was shaking as I dialed Mr. Sterling's number. I didn't even know what I was going to say, but I had to talk to someone who knew the truth. Evans, he answered, his voice its usual gruff bark. I couldn't form a coherent sentence. I just started talking, the words tumbling out in a rush of anxiety and fear. I got the invitation. My mom called. She wants me to just be normal, to not make a scene. I don't know if I can do this. Walk in there, knowing it feels wrong, petty. He listened patiently, not interrupting once. He let my entire storm of doubt and fear wash over the phone line. When I finally ran out of words, the line was silent for a moment. I thought maybe he was disappointed in me, in my weakness. Clara, he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. Do you remember the person who walked out of that baby shower a year ago? Yes, I whispered. Scared, hurt, and alone, he said. That person is gone. She doesn't exist anymore. I want you to listen to me very carefully. You are not a guest walking into their party. You are not the little sister they can push into a corner. You are the woman who outmaneuvered a dozen investment firms. You are the woman who saw value where no one else did. You are the owner of the building. Your name is on the deed. His words were not a comfort. They were a commandment. They sliced through my fear and doubt like a hot knife through butter. Your name is on the deed. It wasn't about being petty. It was about acknowledging a fact. The fear didn't just recede, it evaporated, replaced by a cold, calm, absolute certainty. The steel rod was back in my spine. Walk in there, he continued, his voice firm again. Remember that single, simple fact, and everything else will fall into place. I took a deep breath. Okay, I said, my voice clear and steady now. Okay, I will. I chose my armor carefully. Not a flashy ball gown, but a simple, impeccably tailored navy blue dress. It was the kind of dress that signaled quiet confidence, not a desperate need for attention. It was professional. It was powerful. My hair was pulled back in a sleek, low ponytail. Minimal makeup. I wanted them to see me, not a costume. When I walked through the grand double-door entrance of Lakeside Manor, I felt a strange sense of ownership. I noticed the small scuff mark on the marble floor near the entrance, the slightly faded velvet on the reception chairs. I made a mental note to have them fixed. They were waiting for me, right inside the door to the ballroom, as if they'd been posted as guards. Bea and Derek, a united front of smugness. Clara, so glad you could make it, Bea chirped, her smile as wide as it was fake. Her eyes did a quick, critical sweep of my simple dress, and I could see the flicker of triumphant pity in them. She still can't afford to look the part. We were starting to worry you'd get lost, Derek added with his signature sneer. He gestured vaguely towards the back of the enormous, beautifully decorated ballroom. Don't worry, we saved you a spot. We put you at a table in the back, near the server's station. We figured you wouldn't want to feel too overwhelmed by all this. This was it, the test, the sequel to the stool. A year ago, these words would have shattered me. Now I just smiled. A genuine, calm, untroubled smile. That's so thoughtful of you both, I said, my voice even and warm. Thank you for thinking of me. Their reaction was instantaneous and deeply satisfying. They were completely thrown. They had expected me to flinch, to look hurt, to stammer out a defense. My placid acceptance was a move they hadn't anticipated. A flicker of confusion passed between them. Their script had been thrown out, and they didn't know their next lines. I walked away from them, leaving them standing there with their mouths slightly agape. I navigated through the crush of elegantly dressed guests, heading for the table they had designated as my place of exile. Table 18. It was, as promised, in the farthest corner, offering a spectacular view of the swinging doors to the kitchen. And sitting at that very table, by a strange twist of fate, or perhaps a subtle act of social punishment by my sister, was Mrs. Gable, Derek's mother, the neutral observer. She was seated next to a few distant cousins of Derek's that no one really wanted to talk to. She looked up as I approached, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "Clara," she said, her tone polite but reserved. "How nice to see you." "You as well, Mrs. Gable," I replied, taking my seat. She gave me a polite, questioning nod. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, were full of curiosity. She had seen the exchange at the door. She had seen Derek and Bea's blatant attempt to put me in my place. And now she was watching me, observing the strange, calm way I was handling it. I didn't look wounded. I didn't look angry. I looked serene. It didn't compute. For the next hour, I became the director of a play, hidden in plain sight. I ate my salad. I made polite conversation with the bewildered cousins, and I watched. I watched my sister swan through the room, accepting compliments on her beautiful party. I watched Derek holding court, laughing too loudly at his own jokes. I watched my parents, Helen and Robert, flit from table to table, their faces masks of anxious pride, occasionally shooting nervous glances towards my corner, relieved that I was behaving. They were all performing, so desperate for the approval of their audience. They were completely blissfully unaware that they were standing on my stage, in my theater, and the final act was about to begin. Mrs. Gable barely spoke, but I could feel her gaze on me throughout the party. She was no longer just a neutral observer, she was a jury of one, and she was watching the evidence unfold, a deep, thoughtful frown beginning to form on her face. The moment arrived with a flourish. The lights in the grand ballroom dimmed, and a single spotlight hit the center of the dance floor. A team of waiters, moving with practiced choreography, wheeled out a massive, 5-tiered cake. It was a confectionery masterpiece, covered in pale blue frosting and intricate sugarwork teddy bears. It was ostentatious. It was perfect. My sister Beatrice glided to the microphone set up beside it, basking in the spotlight. She tapped the mic, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent room. "Hello everyone," she began, her voice dripping with emotion. "Thank you all. Thank you so much for coming to celebrate our precious, perfect little Leo on his first birthday. When Derek and I were planning this, we knew we had to find a venue that was just as special as he is. And this beautiful place, Lakeside Manor," she paused for effect, sweeping her hand around the room. "It's just a dream come true." She was about to launch into a long, rambling story that was more about her journey as a mother than her son's birthday, when a quiet movement at the side of the stage caught her eye. The resort's general manager, a tall, impeccably dressed man in his 50s named Mr. Peterson, was walking calmly and purposefully towards her. Bea faltered, her perfect smile tightening with annoyance. This was not part of her script. Mr. Peterson reached the microphone and gave a slight, deferential bow. "Mrs. Vance, a beautiful speech," he said, his voice smooth and professional. He then turned slightly to address the room, his tone carrying an authority that instantly commanded everyone's attention. "And now, if I may, on behalf of the entire staff here at Lakeside Manor, we'd like to take this opportunity to welcome the new owner of the resort, who is gracing us with her presence at this lovely event today, for a special word." A confused murmur rippled through the guests. Bea stared at him, her face a mask of utter bewilderment. New owner? What was he talking about? Mr. Peterson didn't look at Bea. He didn't look at Derek, whose smug expression had been replaced by a frown. His eyes scanned the room, sweeping past the front tables, past my parents, until they landed directly, unmistakably, on me, sitting in my forgotten corner at table 18. "Miss Clara Evans," he announced, his voice ringing clear as a bell through the ballroom's sound system. "Would you perhaps care to say a few words?" Time didn't just stop, it shattered. A collective, audible gasp sucked the very air out of the room. In a single, unified motion, 200 heads swiveled in my direction. The spotlight operator, confused but following the manager's lead, swung the bright beam across the room, illuminating our backwater table in a circle of harsh, revealing light. The faces I could see were a gallery of pure shock. Bea froze completely, her hand half raised to her mouth, her eyes wide with a horror so profound it looked like she'd seen a ghost. Derek's jaw dropped. I mean, it literally unhinged and fell open. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, sickly white. He looked from me to Mr. Peterson and back again, his brain unable to process the information. My parents turned a shade of pale I had never seen before. My mother looked like she might faint. My father just stared, his eyes bugging out, his wine glass frozen halfway to his lips. But the most important reaction, the one that I will cherish forever, was Mrs. Gable's. Sitting right next to me, she was caught in the full glare of the spotlight. Her polite mask disintegrated. Her jaw dropped in perfect, comical unison with her son's. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, stared at me. But then, as the seconds stretched on, her shock melted away. It was replaced by a slow, dawning comprehension, a spark of something respect, amusement, pure admiration, lit up her face, and then she smiled. A wide, genuine, delighted smile. The jury had reached its verdict. I stood up slowly, deliberately. I smoothed the front of my simple navy dress. I felt 200 pairs of eyes on me as I walked from the darkness of my corner into the light. I walked past the stunned faces of my family's friends, past my shell-shocked parents, and right up to the stage. I took the microphone from a perfectly composed Mr. Peterson. "Thank you, Peterson," I said, my voice steady, calm, and amplified to fill every corner of the silent room. I turned to my sister and brother-in-law, who were still standing there like statues. "And thank you all for coming. Bea, Derek, you've thrown a wonderful party. It's truly beautiful." I paused, letting my eyes drift to the magnificent cake. The cake, by the way, is a gift, from me. I looked directly at Bea, whose eyes were now swimming with tears of confusion and rage. I took the liberty of having a special inscription put on the bottom tier. It reads, "Property of Evans Sterling Development." The silence that followed my announcement was absolute. It was a heavy, weighted silence, thick with the fallout of a world turned upside down. Then came the whispers, a ripple starting from the outer tables and rushing inward like a tidal wave. Bea was completely speechless. Her manicured hand was clamped over her mouth, her knuckles white. The only sound she made was a small, choked gasp. Her carefully constructed universe, with her at its glittering center, had just imploded. Derek, however, found his voice. What is this?" he sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "What kind of sick joke is this, Clara?" He looked desperately at his mother, as if seeking an ally, but Mrs. Gable's face was a study in profound disappointment. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking at her son, and for the first time, she seemed to be seeing him clearly. My parents looked like they had aged 10 years in 10 seconds. They were ghosts at the feast, pale and translucent with shock. Their daughter, the failure, the loser, the family charity case, owned this entire palace. The cognitive dissonance was too much for them to bear. I kept my gaze locked on my sister. I held the microphone, but I lowered my voice, so it felt intimate, personal, even though everyone could hear it. "You were worried I couldn't afford a gift, Bea," I said softly, but the microphone carried every syllable. "You were worried I would show up with something from the dollar store, so I wanted to make sure my nephew had a truly special present for his first birthday. I bought him the whole party." I let that hang in the air for a moment. "Don't worry about the bill, it's all taken care of." With that, I turned to the 200 stunned guests. I raised my voice again, projecting a sense of gracious hospitality. "Please," I said with a warm smile, "enjoy the cake. Enjoy the celebration for my wonderful nephew, Leo." I handed the microphone back to a stoic Mr. Peterson, who gave me a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of approval. I didn't walk back to my seat in the corner. That person didn't exist anymore. I turned and walked, not with haste, but with a calm, unhurried pace, towards the grand glass doors that led to the terrace overlooking the lake. I didn't look back. I could feel the chaos erupting behind me. I didn't need to see it. I could feel their world collapsing under the weight of a truth it was not built to withstand. Weeks later, I was walking those same grounds, not as a guest, but as the owner. The autumn air was crisp, and the leaves were turning brilliant shades of red and gold. I was on the phone with Mr. Sterling. We were laughing, actually laughing, as we discussed the final blueprints for our next project, the ethical, community-focused redevelopment of an old downtown hospital. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. The screen flashed. Mom. It was the 10th time she had called that day. The first few calls had been followed by frantic, rambling voicemails full of confusion and demands for an explanation. I hadn't answered any of them. I declined the call and put the phone back in my pocket. I looked out over the serene, blue water of the lake. A gentle breeze rustled the trees. The victory hadn't been in the look on Derek's face when his world crumbled. It wasn't in Bee's shocked silence or my parents' pale horror. Those were just moments, fleeting and ultimately empty. The real victory was this feeling, right here, right now. It was peace. A deep, quiet, unshakable peace that came from building a life so solid, so real, and so completely my own, that their opinions no longer had the power to shake its foundation. It was never really about revenge. It was about rescue. I had rescued myself. I didn't need them to save me a seat at their table anymore. I had built my own, and from where I was standing, the view was magnificent. My story is proof that your true value is never determined by the people who refuse to see it. It's determined by what you're willing to build when no one is watching. What labels have you refused to accept? Let me know in the comments below. I read every one. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about turning pain into power. Thanks for watching.